Welcome, everyone, to Stock Explorers. Today, we're doing a real deep dive into Sarepta Therapeutics. They're a major name in precision genetic medicine, and we want to give you, especially if you're considering investing, a really clear view of their business, how they've been doing lately, and what might be next.
Absolutely. And we'll start by looking at how the market reacted to their latest financial numbers.
Yeah, and then we'll get into their pipeline, their growth potential, profitability, competition,
Yeah.
the whole picture, including the risks.
Okay, so Sarepta. They're definitely at a significant point right now. Q1 of 2025 showed some really strong revenue growth.
Strong is right, mostly driven by Elevidys, their DMD gene therapy.
Exactly. That was the main engine.
So looking at the numbers, Q1 2025, they had, what, a 70% jump in net product revenue compared to last year, reached about $611.5 million.
That's right. And total revenue came in at $744.9 million. That actually beat what analysts were expecting. The estimates were around $693 to $695 million, give or take.
And Elevidys itself, that growth was even more dramatic, wasn't it?
Oh, definitely. Elevidys revenue just surged 180% year over year, hitting $375 million. A lot of that came from the expanded FDA label they got back in June 2024. That really opened the doors.
Makes sense that label expansion was key. But their older drugs, the PMO franchise, Exonio AS51, Vialino AS53, Amondio AS45, they still chipped in.
They did. They brought in $236.5 million. That was up about 5%. So still steady growth there. Looking purely at revenue, you'd think, wow, fantastic quarter.
There's always a but, isn't there? The market reaction wasn't purely positive.
No, it wasn't, because that strong revenue growth, it was kind of overshadowed by a pretty big miss on earnings per share, and then they had to revise their full-year guidance downwards.
Okay, so hold on. Huge sales, but they actually lost money. How does that work? Let's unpack this a bit.
Precisely. So on a GAAP basis, Sarepta reported a net loss of $447.5 million for Q1. That's $4.60 per share lost. Quite a swing from the $36 million profit they had in Q1 last year.
Wow. That's a big difference. What about non-GAAP? Sometimes that paints a different picture.
Even non-GAAP, it was a loss.
Sure.
$332.5 million, or 3.42 cents per share. Analysts were expecting a profit, maybe around 35 cents, or even up to nearly $2 per share in some forecasts. So, yeah, significant miss.
And the stock price reflected that concern, I recall. It dropped after the announcement. So what drove that loss? Where did all the money go?
The main driver by far was R&D. Research and development expenses were huge, $583.6 million in just one quarter.
Okay, why so high?
A very large chunk of that was the upfront payment for a major new collaboration they signed with Arrowhead Pharmaceuticals. It's a strategic investment in future growth, specifically in siRNA therapies.
Ah, the Arrowhead deal. So investing heavily in diversifying the pipeline, moving into RNA interference, but that upfront cost really hit the Q1 bottom line hard.
Exactly. It's a long-term play, but it has a big immediate financial impact. And there were other factors, too.
Like what?
Well, manufacturing costs for their LGMD programs, the limb-girdle muscular dystrophy candidates, those went up. Plus, higher clinical trial costs for Elevidys itself and other pipeline programs.
And the cost of actually selling the drugs. Cost of sales.
That increased significantly, too. Partly just because they sold a lot more Elevidys, naturally, but also some of the inventory they sold in Q1 had actually been produced before Elevidys was approved, and the accounting for that is a bit different. It was expensed earlier, so it impacts the cost of sales calculation now.
Right. So a combination of...
Correct. They need positive results from confirmatory trials, and they have several ongoing. The main one is the Phase 3 ENVISION trial. That's looking at non-ambulatory and older ambulatory DMD patients.
Okay, and how's that going?
Well, there was a bit of a development. Enrollment and dosing in the European and UK parts of ENVISION were temporarily paused. This was due to a reported patient safety event.
A safety event? That sounds serious. What happened?
Details are often limited in these cases, but an independent data monitoring committee, the DMC, reviewed all the data. Their conclusion was that the overall benefit-risk profile for Elevidys still looks favorable. Sarepta is now working with the European regulators to address the issues and hopefully get those trial sites running again.
Okay, so the DMC review was positive. That's good. But that pause must have caused some ripples.
It did. It also affected a Phase 2 study sponsored by Roche called INVOEL, which is looking at younger children with DMD, and another early-stage study, SRP 9001104, evaluating Elevidys with a drug called imlifidase in patients with certain antibodies that was also paused in the EU.
A bit of a setback on the European front then. But other Elevidys news has been more positive.
Yes. Data from the Phase 3 EMBARK study, Specifically, the 2-year follow-up showed functional benefits on secondary endpoints. That included patients who initially got the placebo and then crossed over to receive Elevidys. And they're planning another study, Phase 4 Endure, to collect long-term effectiveness and safety data in a real-world setting.
Got it. Now, moving beyond DMD, limb-girdle muscular dystrophy, LGMD, you mentioned that's a big focus.
Huge focus. They're developing gene therapies for a whole range of LGMD subtypes, 2ER4, 2DR3, 2TR5, 2BR2, 2AR1. Management seems quite bullish, suggesting they expect a, quote, significant number of LGMD approvals in the coming years. That would really broaden their base.
That would be transformative. Any specific LGMD programs close to the finish line?
Their lead candidate there is probably SRP 9003 for LGMD type 2ER4. Phase 3 enrollment is actually complete for that one. And they're aiming to submit the BLA, the application for approval, to the FDA in the second half of 2025. Importantly, they've confirmed it's eligible for the accelerated approval pathway.
Okay, so that's one to watch closely in the next year or so. What about the others?
Well, SRP 9004 for type 2DR3 finished phase 12, and they plan to start phase 3 before the end of this year. For SRP 905 type 2CR5, they've got clearance to start the first human study in the U.S. And for SRP 9010 type 2AR1, they expect to file the IND, the application, to start clinical trials sometime in 2025. They're also running a natural history study called Journey to better understand how several LGMD types progress without treatment.
So a really broad effort in LGMD. And then there's the Arrowhead collaboration we mentioned earlier, the move into Cerno. That's a whole different technology platform.
It is. It's a major strategic expansion into RNA interference. Through this deal, they get access to 4 siRNA drug candidates that are already in clinical trials, plus 3 more that are preclinical.
And what kind of diseases are these targeting?
It broadens their scope quite a bit. They're looking at other muscle diseases, but also conditions affecting the central nervous system and even rare pulmonary diseases. It's significant diversification.
So different targets, different technology, any near-term catalysts investors should be aware of from this siRNA platform.
Definitely. 2 programs, SRP 1001 for FSHD1 and SRP 1003 for myotonic dystrophy type 1, or DM1, both have phase 12 trials ongoing. They expect to release initial data from both in the second half of this year, 2025.
Data readout this year, okay. And for the DM1 drug, they've even mentioned a potential launch timeline.
Yes, they've suggested that if things go well, SRP 1003 could potentially launch around 2029. They also have SRP 1002 for idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis, IPF, in phase 12, and SRP 1004 for SCA2, another neurological condition, started its phase 12 trial late last year. Plus, they're aiming to start the first human study for SRP 1005 in Huntington's disease by the end of 2025.
Wow, okay. So a lot in motion across multiple platforms, DMD, LGMD, and now siRNA. Let's circle back to the financials, though. Future growth and, crucially, profitability. You mentioned they revised their guidance down.
They did. For the full year 2025, total net product revenue is now expected to be between $2.3 million and $2.6 billion. That's down from their earlier range of $2.9 to $3.1 billion. It clearly reflects those Q1 challenges with Elevidys.
And expenses with that big Arrowhead payment.
Expenses are guided significantly higher. Combined non-GAAP R&D and SG&A are now projected between $1.784 billion and $2.184 billion. That big jump is largely the $584 million upfront to Arrowhead, plus potentially hitting some milestones this year, which would mean more payments.
Lower revenue forecast, much higher expenses. That makes getting to profitability pretty tough in the short term, doesn't it?
It definitely makes it more challenging this year. Management has said they expect Elevidys sales to pick up again in the second half, starting around summer. They point to seasonal patterns, thinking the safety event impact is temporary, and also improving some administrative hurdles. Their goal is to be cash flow positive for the rest of 2025.
Cash flow positive, okay. But overall net income profitability for the full year seems like a stretch.
Yeah, given the scale of the increased investment, achieving GAAP or even non-GAAP profitability for the full year looks difficult. Also, something to watch is gross margin. As they sell more of the newly manufactured Elevidys inventory at its full cost, that could put some pressure on margins compared to when they were selling previously expensed inventory.
It's definitely a complicated picture. Strong underlying growth potential, especially with Elevidys, but these significant investments and operational bumps are creating near-term pressure.
Okay, what about competition, particularly in DMD? It's a busy space. You've got other companies working on gene therapies. Solid Biosciences has SGT-003, which they claim shows higher microdystrophin expression and looked okay from early safety data. That could be a future competitor to Elevidys.
We saw Pfizer's attempt didn't work out, which maybe removed one big player.
Yes, Pfizer's phase 3 failure was significant news. It definitely took a major potential competitor off the immediate map for DMD gene therapy. But others, like RegionXBio, are still developing gene therapies.
And non-gene therapy approaches.
Right. Capricor Therapeutics has a cell therapy, Duramyocel, aimed at the heart problems in DMD. That's actually under FDA review right now. It could potentially be used alongside something like Elevidys. And then there's Evolpharmaco. They have an oral drug, Givinostat, which just got a recommendation for approval over in Europe.
So Sarepta's got a strong foothold with their PMOs and Elevidys, especially now, but the landscape is definitely evolving. They mentioned Elevidys has only reached a small fraction of potential patients so far.
That's a key point for their growth story. They estimate they've treated less than 5% of the addressable U.S. patient population for Elevidys. So even with competition, there's theoretically a lot of runway left if they can navigate the commercial and regulatory aspects.
Which brings us neatly to the risks. Every investment carries risk. What should people be really focused on with Sarepta?
Well, starting with Elevidys itself, the biggest near-term risk is probably the fallout from that patient safety event. Will it impact confidence? Will there be delays? Then there are underlying questions about long-term efficacy, especially since the primary endpoint in the main trial wasn't technically met, even though secondary endpoints looked good. Plus, ongoing commercial challenges, smoothing out administrative processes, ensuring treatment sites have capacity, and of course that EMA clinical trial halt in Europe needs resolution.
Okay, those are specific to Elevidys. What about broader financial and operational risks?
The big ones are the revised downward revenue guidance and the sharply higher spending forecast because of Arrowhead. It just puts more pressure on execution and raises the bar for achieving profitability and positive cash flow. They're still quite reliant on a few key products, which always adds risk. And like any biotech growing rapidly, scaling up manufacturing efficiently and managing costs is a constant challenge.
And externally, regulatory environment, legal issues.
Yeah, there are things there too. Gene therapy is still relatively new, and there's always the potential for regulators, maybe like the FDA under new leadership, to take a stricter stance. Sarepta is also still dealing with securities fraud investigations stemming from an earlier patient death and stock drop. That creates uncertainty.
Yeah.
Patent fights are common in this industry. They have ongoing litigation with RegionXBio, for example. Finally, just managing overall market sentiment, which can be quite volatile for biotech stocks.
So wrapping this all up, Sarepta Therapeutics really presents a complex situation for potential investors, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. You have clear evidence of strong revenue growth driven by a really innovative, potentially life-changing gene therapy in Elevidys. But at the same time, they're facing significant hurdles, operational bumps, major financial investments impacting the bottom line right now.
And that big strategic bet on Arrowhead and Suriname, it diversifies them, opens up long-term potential, but it comes at a really significant near-term cost and adds execution risk.
Exactly. And layer on top of that the evolving regulatory landscape, competition, the specific challenges around Elevidys commercialization, and the European situation. It's a lot to weigh.
So for anyone listening and considering Sarepta, it really comes down to balancing that high growth potential against these considerable risks and the company's ability to execute on its, frankly, very ambitious plans. Careful consideration and your own research are definitely key here.
Couldn't agree more. Watching how they manage the Elevidys rollout, progress the LGMD pipeline, integrate the Arrowhead assets, and navigate the financial pressures will be critical in the coming quarters and years.
Well, thank you for walking us through that complex picture, and thanks to all of you for joining us on this deep dive into Sarepta Therapeutics. As always, we strongly encourage you to do your own thorough research before making any investment decisions.
Please remember to subscribe to Stock Explorers if you haven't already for more analyses like this one.
Yes, and if you found this discussion helpful, please give it a like and make sure to activate notifications so you don't miss our future deep dives. Thanks for listening.